Hello, everyone. As we continue our study of the New Testament, we are now moving into the next genre that is important for the New Testament, and that is the epistolary genre. An epistle is a fancy word for letter. And so, in order to understand the letters, and we have a large number of letters in the New Testament, in order to understand these, we have to understand, again, their historical context. Many of the New Testament documents were originally letters, and we have the Pauline letters, and then we have a number of other letters, like the Johannine letters and other texts that purport to be letters. Now, we only have maybe, 13 or more of these letters or so in the New Testament, but um, these are just a small sampling of thousands of ancient letters that we have found from the ancient world. Archaeologists have been quite busy, and we've uncovered a number of papyrus documents that are letters. And so the more we learn about these letters, the more we can learn about how the communication was occurring between Paul, for example, and his followers. Now, there's a few things that I want us to keep in mind about letters. Probably not too many of us write letters nowadays. Sometimes I'll ask a class, when was the last time they wrote a letter? And I get blank stares from the students because people just don't write letters anymore. But letters are a very important form of communication in the ancient world. And there's several things that letters do, and letters can help us understand. First thing we have to understand is that letters are embedded in social context. There are certain norms. There are certain pre-understandings. There are certain ideas and assumptions and context and background that both the sender and the recipient share in order for the communication to work, right? Words passing from one person to another person, if they're even, especially if they're letter, right? Uh, Need to assume that the person who receives this understands the background of the author. And, that's why, for example, the idea of having a pen pal from another country is so intriguing. Because that person writes to you, and as a child, for example, if you have a pen pal, say in, I don't know, Vietnam or something, and they write to you, they're going to have certain understandings, and you're going to have certain understandings. And what can you share about life, right? And children tend to write about things about their parents or pets or school or things that they do share, right? And what kinds of things do you not share in terms of your context? Things that are unspoken that need to be spoken that you can learn about your pen pal, right? And that's what deepens it. The social context, we can learn a lot about the societal context from these letters. Second thing, letters tend to fictionalize presence of the sender to the receiver. It's as if the recipient is receiving the presence of the writer, right? Maybe you all have traveled abroad. Maybe you've been away from home. Maybe you've been in a camp situation, or you've been away from home and at school, and you have received letters or postcards, right? Um, those give a sense of presence of the person who sent it to the receiver. I can remember when I was when I was a child growing up, my father, he was a German professor. He used to take a group of students over to Germany many summers, and he'd be gone for weeks at a time, 3, 4 weeks at a time before he could come back with, the student group. And he would write the letter or a postcard. And, I'd get a postcard from my dad, and it was like he was present with me, you know. Um, Those of you who have served in the military know the importance of sending and receiving letters, actual physical letters, something you can handle and carry. Um, when I worked as an intern up in Brooklyn in New York, when I was going to seminary in New Jersey, I used to work in a church that had a ministry to inmates who were actually members of the congregation. And every Sunday we would sit down and write them letters. And those letters from the congregation and those letters that they would write to us were their way of participating in the community. Right? So we would call this virtual presence nowadays. We love to use this virtual language. But I've used fictionalized, just not so that we don't confuse this with something digital or electronic, because virtual has become so digital and electronic. But it's the idea as the sender is virtually present with the recipient. This happened in the ancient world as well. You can remember, those of you may have seen a video clip or the video of the movie Gladiator. I don't know if any of you remember that movie, Gladiator. The gladiator, the man in that movie, he carried letters from his family, and he would set up those letters, and he would light the little candles, and he would place the figurines of his family, and he would put his letters up there by the figurines, and that would bring back their presence. It was also a form of worship. We do believe in the ancient world, when letters were received or sent, people would hold them dearly, right? It's not that they were worshiping them, but they would use them in almost worship-like practices. Letters are also dialogical. There's a communication going back and forth. And part of what we're going to be playing with as we look at Paul's letters is, what's the dialogue? And here's the funny thing, and I've said this about letters to my classes for years, and I really do believe it's true. When we read the letters of the New Testament, when we read Paul's letters, we're reading other people's mail. We're reading the letters that Paul intended the Thessalonians to read, or the Corinthians to read, or the Romans to read. There's a dialogue going back and forth between Paul and his community, and we don't have one of the directions of the communication. We don't have the letters that Paul received. So we have to almost reconstruct the dialogue and the situation from the letter. The letters also incorporate other kinds of texts. You often have poems, essays, narratives. Now, I've got a little example to help you understand how letters function in these ways. This is a cute little letter. Pause it and read it. Pause it and read it. Okay, so you've had a chance to read it. Yeah, it's a silly note that you might find on a playground, but place yourself in the minds of a future archaeologist. So say 2,000 years from now, an archaeologist is digging off a playground from the 21st century or 20th century, and he finds this note, right? And he's trying to learn something about the society in which it's written. Now, letters are written in a social context, so what can we learn about this? What can we learn from this, right? You probably have noticed a few things, right? You've probably noticed the misspellings here. You've probably noticed the grammatical issue here. It needs to be T-O-O, right? You're real cute. It should be apostrophe R-E. So, you can notice some things and say, well, I know that a fourth grade student is a child, right? And I can tell from how he's writing that he's a child. Well, that's sort of basic clues from the literature that you might pick up. In other words, you might pick up that this person is not necessarily a competent author, a competent writer in his language yet. So you could then reconstruct that this is a child writing this. Now, Here's the other thing. If you know a little bit more about third grade or fourth grade, say 2,000 years from now, they do know something about the educational system in America, they might be able to also construct the age of this child. But what else can you learn from this? Well, this is where you have to ask some basic sociological questions. Is this a dating culture? Is the culture in which these children participate a dating culture? Right? Not all cultures in this world are dating cultures, are they? Some cultures, arranged marriages are practiced. In fact, until fairly recently, that probably was the majority of the cultures in the world. But this child is not participating. These children do not appear to be participating in arranged marriages, or else they wouldn't be playing these dating games. What about the education, gender issues? Here we have an issue in a situation in which boys and girls are on the playground at the same time and are playing together. Well, is that true of all societies today? Well, perhaps not. Right? So the archaeologist can then reconstruct the fact that, okay, in this culture in which this note was situated, there probably was a serious dating culture, right? And there was gender education, or education of both genders, male and female. So perhaps a little more equality than some cultures that one might be familiar with in the 20th or 21st century. What else can we learn about this? Well, when you think about it, what kind of society was this? A wealthy society or a poor society? Well, it's clearly a society in which a child has access to writing materials, paper and pen, and can use those for a game or for something frivolous, right? A note like this. Silliness. You know, that's important to notice as well. I remember one of the things when I went and did a mission trip to Nicaragua, they asked us to bring suitcases full of paper and markers because the children there couldn't afford them. And they needed that for their programs that they were going to do with the kids. Well, how about that? Right? There are many cultures in this world where children do not have access to paper and pencil like this. And certainly not to use it for something so superfluous as a note like this. And then I also said that in my previous slide, letters are dialogical. There is a dialogical element to this. Susie can respond yes or no. Apparently she did not respond. This was found in a crumpled situation on the playground. Poor Johnny, right? And letters incorporate other texts. This must have been a common poem from the ancient 20th century about some creature named Mr. Hume. Who knows what that refers to, right? Some things can be totally bizarre in letters. Okay, just a joke. But it's interesting how any letter can teach us a lot about the social situation, the social context, the dialogical nature of the letter, the virtual presence. Johnny can't be present with Susie, so he sends her this virtual presence. He can't ask her himself, so he sends her a note to do the work. And letters incorporate other texts. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Now, we do have a number of literary epistles that have survived from the ancient world. Letters from Plato and some of these other guys that you have, Cicero, Pliny. You know, these are more like essays than they are letters. Yeah, they're in form letters, but they're long, they're very philosophical, they're full of allusions to other texts. Great stuff. The question is, are the New Testament epistles like these long letters, or are they more like sort of simple communications that we found? My idea is that the letters that Paul writes, for the most part, except for maybe Romans, are not in this category. They're not literary epistles. they are more like communications to his communities. And so we found a whole bunch of these. And really, in more recent years, these have been uncovered. In the more recent centuries, these have been uncovered. You know, the monks in the Middle Ages, they copied the literary epistles. So we have some of these just from what monks had copied. But these are more recent. At least these papyri and ostraca that we found are everyday simple and brief communications. And that has made a revolution in how we understand Paul's letters, because we see that Paul probably is participating in this kind of letter experience. Oftentimes families would hire a professional scribe, or someone would hire a professional scribe. Obviously, not everybody could write. Only maybe 10 to 15% of the people could write. But often dictated to a professional scribe and then sent on their way through various communication channels, and then received, right? So we have business letters, family letters, all kinds of letters. You're going to get a chance to read some of these in the exercise this week. Now, this is a cute little ostrakhan letter. Now, you probably are not familiar with this word ostrakhan. Ostrakhan means basically a piece of pottery that's been broken off, and it's then been used for a little note. And you can see this is about, what, 13 lines in Greek, 14 lines. It's either, yeah, it's in Greek, hauti erko mai. So, therefore I shall come. Probably that's to. Right, I can't just read it off the, I'd have to study it. But, so you can read portions of this letter. And this is basically just probably a simple communication saying, hey, I'm going to come. You're going to be there. A lot of times we find memo types activities on these ostraca. Yeah, buy so much of this and so much of that, and then sell that, right? This is what an ancient papyrus letter looks like. And if you'll recall, papyrus is the cheapest writing material, made out of reeds that were sort of pressed together. And so you see the business side here of the letter, and usually on this side would be the instructions, and it would sort of be wrapped up in a scroll, and then on this side would be the instructions for delivery. One other thing that I think you need to keep in mind, that I think is important, is that Greco-Roman letters did have a common format, just like we, generally write our letters, dear so-and-so, and end with sincerely, whatever, In the Greco-Roman letter, you have various forms. Most of them are apparent in all of these letters. They start with the prescript. So they start with the sender's name, followed by the recipient's name, followed by a greeting. And then they go further. After the greeting, there's usually some thanksgiving or wish for help or prayer, all together. So I wish that you were healthful. I'm continually thankful, praying for you to the God of such and such and such and such. Right? So that's how they begin. So Paul, the name of the sender, to Timothy, many greetings. Right? And then I pray for you all the time, wishing for your health, that you might be well. Right? And then there's the body of letter. And that's where the letter writer does what he's trying to do with the letter. And then at the end, there's a formula, farewell, fare thee well. And then, usually, because letters were community kinds of things, there's a list of greetings to others who are going to be with the recipient when the letter is received. Now, I think this is very interesting. What that tells us is that in the ancient Greco-Roman world, letters were not necessarily private. We think of letters as being more private today. If I receive a letter, I read it and then I contemplate it and think about it, especially if it's a love letter or something like that. Those, when you were dating, we had these kinds of letters that we would send, and you'd treasure it and you'd hold it and think about it. All right, okay, I'm being romantic, but yeah, we did do that, right? But it's more like, imagine a letter that you might send to someone that they would share with others. Birthday cards. My wife Christmas cards, other kinds of cards. My wife, she keeps all of our cards when we receive cards for whatever events on our um, uh, dining room, not on our dining room table, but on the buffet table, right, for everyone to see, or for her to be reminded of the people who are thinking of her back home, or you've been in a birthday party and the person opens the letter, and if it's cute and funny, they share it and they pass it around, and everybody looks at the letter and the card, right, that they receive. Um, when these were received in the ancient world, probably they were read aloud, and the whole community read the letter. You had one person read it aloud, and you had the whole community with the recipient. So there was a communal aspect of reading that was also part of this. And so we see how that works with Paul's letters. When he's writing these communities, he's really writing not just an individual, but these were received. It was probably a real big event when these were received and read aloud, right? And then they continued to read them aloud in their weekly worship meetings, right? And that's how Paul's letters, I think, began to gain the status of scripture for the communities. They would get them, they would read them aloud, and they would try to understand them. They would talk about them. Maybe you'd have the leader of the congregation step up and interpret them. That's the beginning of preaching on Paul's letters, right? So we can see how they would have already had the status of being authoritative for the community. Okay, well, I hope that's enough for you all to understand a little bit about the form of Greco-Roman letters and why they're important and why it's important to know about them. Thank you.